Well, welcome everybody to this online seminar that's brought to you by the hugely respected Bromley by Bow Centre in East London. So I'm Ben Collins. I'm the Director of System Development for the South East London Integrated Care System. I'll be your moderator for this session, but the stars of the show are the Bromley by Bow Centre and our panel of experts. And the question I think we are grappling with today is, how do we make the most use of NHS facilities? How do we create really humane, healing environments for people? How do we create facilities that connect services and people, that deliver whole person care and support the resilience of our communities? So I'm delighted to present a really wonderful panel for us to think through these questions. We have Dan Hopewell, who's the Director of Knowledge and Innovation at the Bromley by Bow Centre, and who was there, I think, from the very beginning, laying the cobblestones in the courtyard of Bromley by Bow. And of course, many of us see Bromley by Bow as the perfect example of a hub that brings together health, other public services, the voluntary sector and communities. So Dan, Dan will tell us a little about the development of the centre and lessons from Bromley by Bow on the design and the use of community facilities. And I'm then going to spend a little time in Q&A with a panel of 4 experts. So we have Laura Marshall-Andrews. She's a principal GP in Brighton Health and Wellbeing Centre. Mark Harrod, who's a healthcare estates consultant who supports the NHS in major new projects. Will Nicholson, who's a health and wellbeing consultant, who I know very well in South East London from the wonderful Thriving Stockwell project he'll talk about, and Ria Horlock, who's the head of corporate social responsibility at NHS Property Services. So just a little bit of housekeeping before we kick off. We would really like you to ask questions on Slido throughout this first half Q&A session, and then we'll spend the rest of the session getting through as many of your questions as possible. So please log on to Slido. You will find the information on how to do this in the chat function. So log on to Slido. You might need to plug in the event code and ask questions as we go. Please don't be shy. Say who you are and where you come from in your question if you're willing, unless you're particularly eager to be anonymous. And we'll try to get through your questions. And we may ask some people to turn their video on at some point and ask their questions directly to the panel. So, kicking off, I guess just on a personal note, I think I visited Bromley by Bow for the first time around 7 years ago. And I walked off this really, really busy road, through the courtyard, down a lovely corridor, and then the space opened up for a cafe and various facilities. And you had health, you had other public services, you had the voluntary sector, all coming off in spokes from the centre of the Bromley by Bow Centre. And I remember sitting in the courtyard, in the garden at the back, with Rob and Dan on a sunny day, watching families and various sports and picnics going on in the back garden. I thought, well, this is like no other health centre I've ever been to. So I wanted to start us with a conundrum or a challenge, because many people have visited the Bromley by Bow Centre, many much more influential than me, and they've all come away inspired. And yet, I think it's still really quite difficult to find comparable facilities around England. They do exist, and we've got some wonderful examples on our panel that we'll talk about. But overall, we've had the Bromley by Bow Centre for a few decades now, and yet spreading this model of integrated, compassionate, welcoming facilities for health and care, that's proved really difficult. So I think that's the challenge for today. How can we take the spirit of Bromley by Bow and spread it more broadly across England? And with that note, Dan, I think if you could put your video on, I think that the plan would be for you to spend the first 5-10 minutes or so just telling us a little bit about the history of Bromley by Bow, how you designed the centre, and what turned out to be really important in the design. And please do put your video on, Dan. You're allowed to now.
Great, thank you. And I mute myself indeed as well. Thank you so much, Ben. So actually, I didn't quite arrive at the beginning, a little bit later, but if you had arrived at the beginning, you would have encountered this sort of scrappy 3-acre local authority park that's top right here, with that's the back of the Bromley by Bow church as it then was, with this marvelous William Kent arch that had come from Northumberland Avenue, glued onto the back of this East End church. And whilst we're talking about design and facilities, I think it's really important to talk about the people, because in a sense they are the people who create the design and the people who create the sense of intent of what we're trying to do. And so Bromley by Bow's origins were in a kind of, in a time of quite great convulsion in the UK in the mid-1980s, mass unemployment, 3/4 of the population of Tower Hamlets had left. It was a changing population. The remains, if you like, of the white East End population that had been working in the docks until they closed down in the 60s, overlaid by considerable migration from Bangladesh, from rural Bangladesh, and all these empty terraced houses. If any of you remember Rachel Whiteread's house, that house that she filled with concrete and then broke the house away, leaving the inner print of it. That was a couple of streets away from Bromley by Bow. And there was lots of co-ops growing up in the East London at the time, some of them housing artists, lots of squatting going on in London at the time as well. So lots of other people with alternative lifestyle ideas coming into the area. And in a sense, Bromley by Bow was to some extent the confluence of these factors coming together in the Bromley by Bow church, which had a tiny and aged congregation at the time, who generously opened the doors of the church to this new community and the newer communities, with Andrew Mawson, who was the incoming priest, and started to rebuild community at Bromley by Bow. And the first 12 years of our journey, we had no health service at Bromley by Bow, except of course, now understanding the social determinants of health, everything that we were doing with a small community cafe and food growing and artists running arts workshops in the studio spaces that the church had provided for them, and some social care provision. Everything we were doing really was about building community and building health and well-being. It was then that we stumbled across the idea of building general practice into this kind of emergent community hub model, through really identifying the poor quality of existing facilities within our area. And the NHS finding this almost incomprehensible, the idea of communities building their own health centres. This then coincided with John Major's Healthy Living Centre programme. And we said we wanted to become a healthy living centre, we wanted to bring in primary care, and we wanted it all to be developed by the community. But I think that probably is one of the key lessons of the Bromley by Bow Centre, that it was, and it still is, owned by the community and was developed by the community. And it had 12 years to gestate in the extensive church buildings, and therefore understanding the kind of model of what we were trying to do as a prototype before indeed the architects started to then design the building with those who were involved with Bromley by Bow. And we had extensive outreach programs. We had a very culturally and ethnically diverse set of users of the centre long before we built the Healthy Living Centre. In building the Healthy Living Centre, we also persuaded the local authority to gift us that 3-acre park and on a 30-year lease. And we set about tearing up the tarmac and transforming it into a beautiful community facility from what it had been before, and building the Healthy Living Centre out and into and across the park. So our buildings intermingle with the space. And we're conveniently sited on the corner of 2 streets, which allows us to thread traffic through the courtyards of Bromley by Bow. And also very conveniently, a major supermarket on the other side of the road, which again generates traffic. But principally as well, general practice is a wonderful way. You know, every waiting room in the UK has got 100, 150 patients sitting in it every morning and every afternoon. A wonderful way of generating footfall as well. But of course, Bromley by Bow, it's the integration of all of this that comes together that's the important thing. There's a picture of our entrance at Bromley by Bow. And I was talking to the architect actually not so long ago, and this entrance actually is based on the Moorish inner courtyard, but instead of it being an inner sanctum, in this case, it's the entrance courtyard to Bromley by Bow, with some inviting seating, not an NHS sign in sight. Scale is very, very important. The design features, you'll see that tower there. That's actually a tower with a bell on it and a clock that rings the hours. you know, the sense of space, the sense of ceremony as well. The backdrop of Bromley by Bow is actually modelled on the Doge's Palace in Venice, but it's also a space that absolutely forms the backdrop for community celebrations, community events, and so on. But creating a space that would make people feel at ease, that was domestic in scale, that used high quality materials, that had wonderful sight lines that invite people to explore, but also how it's then populated with staff who help people to navigate rather than a forest of signage, for example. This is our cafe at Bromley by Bow. Those are our values, but this is our cafe at Bromley by Bow. That's a time banking, skill sharing session going on in the cafe. The cafe is a central hub really of Bromley by Bow. And when we think about the transformation of work environments these days, the fact that many people now work on laptops in cafes, you'll see people doing job searches with clients in the cafe at Bromley by Bow, for example, or our walking groups and some of our elders Bengali groups, for example, at Bromley by Bow meet up in the cafe every week. The cafe becomes a central hub, and it, as you just described, Ben, it backs out onto the 3-acre park. So in the summer, we've got lots of cafe tables and chairs in the park as well. And you'll see people gardening in the park, for example. There's visibility into our social care space, which is run by our artists. So you can immediately see people making art at Bromley by Bow. So creating a building that allows people to wander, to linger, to loiter, to spend as long as they want at Bromley by Bow, to build it into the fabric of their lives. It's where you come and have a cup of coffee if you're in the neighborhood with a friend. So really thinking about the purpose of bringing people together more than just throughputing people through services. This gives you a glimpse of some of those activities that I've just mentioned. That's a community meal taking place in our cafe one evening as part of our time bank, for example, gardening going on, arts workshops and so on. So this whole idea of kind of movement, the fact that staff also move between the different buildings and volunteers and clients as well. So it's a site of continual movement, and you're inside and outside quite a lot at Bromley by Bow. So it's not about sort of a rectangular building that's kind of enclosing everything, but having everything exposed, I think, at Bromley by Bow. And then the juxtapositions of where things go on. So the health centre's got lots of non-health activities in it as well, for example, and some health promotion activities happen in the community centre. So and our GPs, for example, as they say, you know, there's no staff lunchroom at Bromley by Bow. Our staff have lunch amongst the public. And if you walk up the open access staircase to the first floor, which any member of the public can do without announcing their arrival, there's no reception desk to walk past, you are literally into the heart of the building. And upstairs on the first floor, we have public service rooms intermingled with back office functions. There's no inner sanctum at Bromley by Bow. There's no part of the building where the chief exec and the senior leadership and the finance team and the HR team and the facilities team are somehow squirreled away, you know, out of the gaze and out of contact with the public. All of those back office functions are in public access corridors where, you know, you might find an ESOL student who's a bit lost looking for their classroom, popping into the finance office and saying, do you know where my ESOL class is this morning, or whatever it happens to be. And that, I think, is absolutely critical. If we want to genuinely consider that these buildings are publicly owned, shared with the public, they are, it's not about creating sort of privileges for staff where they can hide away from the public, but it's actually about, if we want co-productive environments, we really do need to philosophically understand what that means. It means environments which are owned by the community, both psychologically and physically, and in Bromley by Bow's case, actually genuinely in terms of governance terms and ownership, owned by our community. That's that last slide of that wonderful intergenerational tea party taking place at Bromley by Bow, partly curated by our artists. You can see all that wonderful artistic influence as well. You might want to compare that to some sort of drab community room in a health centre somewhere with sort of formica topped tables and sort of institutional plastic chairs or something like that, and how different that might feel if you've got the community making these events themselves with artists working with them in a facility like Bromley by Bow. That's the last slide, Ben.
Super, thank you very much, Dan. So I remember talking to your architect, who you brought in in the very beginning to design the courtyard and build the new buildings for Bromley by Bow. And it was a very unusual meeting. He invited all of his children to come along because they had also been there at the weekends for years at Bromley by Bow, laying the cobblestones in the courtyard and doing other work. And it just struck me that that is such a fundamentally different way of going about designing a facility to the approach that we would typically go through in the English NHS, where typically we'll be allocated some resources centrally. We'll have a relatively short period to consult the public and get a design and try and spend the money before it's taken away from us. So how do we recreate that if we don't have 12 years to gestate, Dan? Can what you've done be achieved through the public sector?
Yes, and that is a challenge, and we're working with a number of people to work their way through exactly that, the challenge that you've posed there. I think it does involve a shift of power. I think it involves the public sector bringing the community into the discussions as early as possible and as fully as possible, and understanding that, I mean, people say, well, surely every community is different. Well, in a sense, every community is different, but also every community is the same, in the sense that in every community, you will find people who want to get involved in these projects, who've got ideas for them and want to be part. I mean, we've got some members of staff who are local people who've been members of staff at Bromley by Bow or volunteers at Bromley by Bow now for decades. And the model, therefore, is their model. And it's a shared model with professionals. Of course, communities need professionals as well. But it's this understanding that the system has more to gain by giving away power than by retaining power. It has more to gain by learning from the community than it has by imposing upon the community. And it does that, of course, with the best of intentions and often unwittingly or unknowingly. But it has to be about how you bring the community into these processes from the beginning and listen to the community about what the community wants and the ideas that they want. It therefore has to involve voluntary sector organisations. And of course, in every part of the country, you will find very, very, very long-standing voluntary sector organisations who are deeply rooted within their communities. And they need to be brought in as equal partners in these ventures, I think, with the statutory partners and with the community itself.
So a fundamental shift in power and decision-making. There's one quick question that's come in that's directly for you, Dan. Peter Haig asked, the land was gifted, but where did the funding come from to rebuild the centre?
So part of the funding came through SRB grants, I believe. But actually the Bromley by Bow Centre, the community charity, when we finally got the green light from the NHS to build a health centre, and that took some considerable persuasion on our part that a small community charity could build a health centre. We went to the Norwich Union, as it then was, and borrowed £800,000, I believe, to build a community centre that was therefore built by the patients and rented back to the NHS.
Super, thank you, Dan. So look, we're going to move on to listen to our panel, but Dan, you and the Bromley by Bow Centre, dare I say it, you are the stars of our show, so I think we will bring you back towards the end to pick up further questions and to reflect on our panelists' comments. So I am wondering whether Laura, Mark, Will and Ria could put their videos on. And while you're doing that, I have been looking through the introductions. This is a fantastic group. I think we have 350 people registered. I don't know how many are on the call, but clearly a huge number. And we have people from all over the United Kingdom, from Northern Ireland, from Scotland, from Wales, from the Mayor's office. So welcome everybody. I have only one complaint to you all, which is that so far you've only put one question on Slido, which is going to make my job in the second half of this session really quite demanding. So could you reflect on your questions and put them in? Please let us know who you are when you put your questions in, because it would be lovely to draw you into the conversation. But Mark and Laura and Will and Ria, you all bring considerable expertise on this question of how we develop our facilities from different perspectives. And I think I've suggested that the big question we're trying to answer is, how can we bottle the spirit of Bromley by Bow and achieve it through the NHS and in different circumstances without 12 years to gestate, and with all of the complexities of NHS bureaucracy to contend with. Laura, you're a GP in Bristol, and I think, oh, sorry, Brighton, I do apologise. And I think you took over your practice in 2013. You took an existing practice and you've transformed it. I've been looking on the internet into what looks like an absolutely wonderful health and well-being centre. So I would like you to just tell us for a few minutes how you go about the process of adapting existing facilities into something wonderful.
Thank you, and hi to everybody. So yeah, we took over this practice. It was my practice manager and we moved from a very nearby practice. The reason we chose this one was it was a practice in trouble, and there was one remaining partner who was desperate to leave. It's an inner city practice that's right in the middle of Brighton. It's in between 4 big homeless hostels, and it was a tricky place to work. The police were here a lot, and they were really struggling to get locums, and it was on the verge of being closed. But the thing that was attractive was that there were no other partners, because I'd been trying to do something similar in the practice I was in, but I was being blocked by my 2 partners. So we moved here, and as luck would have it, we'd been talking to a nearby community wellbeing centre where they had lots of complementary therapists, and they were being kicked out of their building. So we suggested that they moved in with us, and we borrowed against the practice. So this is one way of raising funding. It was quite an edgy way of raising funding, and I'm not sure every GP practice would be up for it, but we just borrowed the money from the bank and against the practice. So we borrowed about 120,000, and we sort of gutted the practice and bought the flat or rented the flat next door. And we had to renovate it in the evening and at the weekend because we had to keep delivering care. So it was difficult. And Gary and I would have to arrive at 5 in the morning and sort of sweep up and replug all the computers and try and turn it back and put dust sheets where all the building work was going on. And it took about 3 months, but then we managed to change it into a much lighter, brighter space, and we were aiming for rooms which you could use either with a therapist or by a doctor, so which had a much more sort of comfortable feel, not like the room I'm in at the moment, which is our kind of we do a lot of clinical stuff in here. But when we'd got it to that point, we had quite a lot of pushback. We did this sort of grand unveiling after a long weekend of our reception desk, and we'd moved the whole waiting room around. So we'd cleared a big space in the waiting room, which we now use as a kind of interactive art gallery. And we'd put a small little desk, sort of just like a table, and taken away. It was a high reception, which had all these perspex screens with the little holes, you know, like the old banks. So we took all of that down, and our receptionists came in on Monday morning and they all just completely freaked out, and they were just going, I'm not standing behind there, we're all going to get killed, and we've got to get the builders back and we want the screens back. So we said, okay, we'll try and get the builders back, but the builders had gone to another job and we couldn't get them back right away. But it was just extraordinary what happened over the next 2 weeks. So all our sort of most aggressive patients came in, and they just behaved differently because it had sort of flowers on the reception desk, and the reception desk was low, and we had all this art that the art groups had put up, and it just had this completely different feel about it. So I really wish we'd filmed some of the guys coming in, actually, because it was really remarkable how they were slightly floored by it. But we have only had to call the police out 4 times in the last 8 years, and that used to literally be at least once a week, if not more. So that was, I really didn't expect it to happen like that, but that to me was a huge lesson in how the environment affects people's behaviour. And then, so we had the therapists who were working here, and then we changed the feel of the building. And then I had some friends who were artists, and we just started running arts groups, which we called healing arts groups. I'd been out to a hospital in the Bronx where they were running these healing arts groups. And we had a writer, a filmmaker, a dancer, and a singer. And so we just started all these groups with them, and we didn't have any governance. We didn't do anything. So we just started them, and they became really, really successful, and loads of people wanted to join them. So we applied for some funding from the CCG for that innovation thing, and we were told that it wasn't medicine, and so we couldn't have any funding. So then we went to the council, and the council gave us, I think it was £4,000 or something to start with, and with that we then Emma Drew, who has now become the director of HERA, which is the Healing, Expressive and Recovery Arts group. We used that to pay her to come and start putting some governance around the groups, and then to work up a bid. And she did a bid to the Arts Council for 75,000, I think, which was successful. And then once you get that, then you can start to sort of build on it. And so we've now got sort of recurrent funding from the Arts Council, and we've really grown the HERA project. So it's huge at the moment. And we're spanning into different practices in Brighton. And I think we've just put a bid into Bearing to see if we can get some money to go out into 10 different practices, different areas across the country. In over COVID and stuff, you know, we did all of the stuff online, and it seems to have just kind of taken off and become a life of its own, I guess, very much like Bromley by Bow. Once you get people involved and the community involved, and it then draws artists and really interesting, innovative people in. So it just happened like that for us.
Super, Laura. And what I take from this is that, you know, when we visit facilities like Bromley by Bow, they're often so far away from where we are that it feels a bit overwhelming and we don't know what to do. And your story tells us there's actually a vast amount you can do pragmatically within your existing facilities. And I've noticed GP practices where simply putting children's pictures on the walls transforms the sense and tells us this isn't just a service industry, this is a healing environment as well. And fascinating that taking down those barriers encourages more warmer and kinder behaviour. Thank you, Laura. We'll come back to this because there are some questions about the role of the arts coming in. Mark, your expertise lies in a different area, that the building of gleaming new facilities in the NHS, including within South East London. And I think you're working on both a major health and wellbeing hub at the moment, and also a new primary care centre. So tell us a little bit about how we bottle Bromley by Bow and inject it into these construction projects.
Thanks, Ben, and thank you, Laura. Yeah, I also do work with existing buildings, and that's how I met Will. But I think the interesting point, the other thing I should say is I've been associated with Bromley by Bow for almost as long as Dan has been there, so that hopefully the inspiration has in some way rubbed off to sort of the way in which I think and work anyway. The building, I'm the program director for Barking Riverside Health and Wellbeing Hub, which is in Barking and Dagenham, which is one of the poorest boroughs in London, and massive issues around health inequalities. Barking Riverside is a development of nearly 11,000 homes, 25 to 30,000 new population coming in. which will inevitably be a mixed population and different from the existing population of Barking and Dagenham. It will be 12 minutes away from Canary Wharf. It will have riverside apartments and the like. So the question there is, how do we support the health and well-being of that community and not exacerbate health inequalities with the existing community? That there's a real danger in putting a huge amount of money and capacity into a new building, but actually, or a new town. Effectively, it's a reasonable sized town, but actually, what we want to do is work with the existing. So what we have been doing is working with the existing population, very much seeing it as one locality, working with the existing population to develop their understanding of what a healthy Thames ward looks like. And so the definition comes from them. And as a group, the professionals effectively took that away and said, okay, well, what does that mean in terms of services? But that professionals, by that, it did include the voluntary sector, it included the local head teachers, it included health professionals and local authorities. So it was a fairly broad group to develop the model of care, and then a model of care that was also very much focused around the wider determinants of health. So if it is about how do we build a healthy and well community, how do we build relationships, how do we support the agency of local people to actually make things happen themselves. So it's worth saying that the building itself is the last thing you think about. Actually, what we're doing is working towards a healthy system, and then identifying what the right services are that support people at times of crisis and illness, and then how do you provide those services. So it may be that those services are provided in a brand new spanking building, but it might be that those services can be provided in ecology centre or in a cafe or wherever it might be. I think one of the other principles there is to involve the community at the very heart of the process. So as I said, it started with community identifying what they saw as a healthy and well community. We have set up a collaborative design group, which is 50% local residents and 50% officers on various, including voluntary sector. That collaborative design group worked with the architects around the early design of the building. We also took them on a tour of existing buildings, including Bromley by Bow. And there were a number of things. I was glad Dan showed the slide of the entrance, because there were, the intention of the tour was to give
Mark seems to have frozen a little bit there. We'll give him just a second to see if he comes back. But Will, brace yourself. You may be picking up.
Am I back? Sorry.
You're back.
The wonders of technology. So thinking about the way in which design impacts on function and the sense of building being a community place. So there were a number of things that came out of that feedback to the architects, that the building has to be in a human scale. And part of the problem about building these huge buildings is that they are often seen as concrete boxes that don't have any sense of human scale. What I loved about the description of Laura and the work that she's done, it absolutely has human scale. Not only that, it has human skin involved in the building of it. There's a real earth organic connectedness in that. The role of the arts was also recognised as being important by the residents when they visited. So you come into the entrance of Bromley Bow and you see art, creativity in every element. So we're in the process in this and in the project in Plymouth of talking to artists, not only in terms of using the arts, using the building effectively as an exhibition space, but also how do we work with artists for the building to be creative itself, so that that it includes creative spaces, it includes things that reveal and hide. The sense again at Bromley by Bow of the importance of the green space around it. And so, both the Plymouth and the Barking and Dagenham project, where is green and growing spaces in all of this? Taking the outside in and the inside out. So you've got a real connectivity with the community. Certainly in the Plymouth project, the building a bit like the original intention of the building that William is in at the minute, is a street effectively that takes people from Western Avenue into the city centre and the market. So the idea that it is a place that people, as Dan said, through cuts, it becomes people's place. We're talking to local traders about putting up pop-up stalls in there. We've got community kitchen. We're looking at growing spaces and linking with growing spaces. So the community kitchen and the cafe can use ingredients that are grown by the community. But I think going back to the community bit, if 70% of health outcomes are delivered through non-clinical activity, then actually our buildings should reflect that and should have space for that wide range of community activity. And certainly in both Barking Riverside and the Plymouth project, we're working with the community to support them to effectively run programs that use the space. So, whether that's a TRA, whether that's arts programs and the way Laura described it, working with local colleges to provide access to education, to physical activity classes and outdoor gym, working with local community activators to use that outdoor space as physical activity. So that whole sense of the community being at the heart of these projects and building the resilience, as the title of the webinar says, so using our activity to support the resilience of communities, but also recognizing that, and the power shift, that the communities often have the answers themselves. It isn't about us as professionals coming in. So there are things clearly that Laura's a GP, or we've got mental health services and outpatients and things like that. Clinicians are important, but actually there's a whole range of skills and capacities and agency that the community brings into this that provides the real grounding for what the building does, and that the building exists in the same way as Bromley by Bow does, not as a separate entity, but linked to the wider community as part of a matrix of assets that supports people's health and well-being. So those are some of the things that come to mind. I think one of the other things was around Laura's comment about reception. We're looking in both projects at not having a reception at all, using a concierge model, and having well-being navigators whose role is to welcome people, to get to know them, to make sure that they go to the right service, that opens up space to be much more flexible because then people aren't stuck behind desks. It builds on relationship, which I think is key to what Bromley by Bow is about. It's about an equal relationship between people, first and foremost. So there are a number of things that we're trying to do in those new buildings that are very much about learning from the experience of Bromley by Bow and others. That's a starter for Ben.
That's hugely fascinating. I've got an efficiency proposal for you. Rather than those concierges, why don't you just have a touch screen and print out a little piece of paper with a number on for people to hold on to while they wait for the announcement? Would that work?
No, it wouldn't. I mean, I think part of it, and it is a challenge for the NHS, is how do we deal with technology in a way? There are people who will come in. The question I know that's appeared in there in terms of online consultancy and self-registering for appointments. There are people who have agency to be able to do that. But actually, what we need is first and foremost is human relationships. We are social animals, and the Bromley by Bow model is all around that kind of relationship, as Dan described. The cafe brings everyone together. It isn't that there's a separate eating place for staff. So that the importance of relationship. But there are ways of using technology. So we are looking at an app that has a map of the building that someone comes in and because it's going to be quite a big building, it could be complicated. We will have people that will take them to places if they want to, but they can also use an app to do that. So there are ways of using technology that I think furthers human interrelation rather than as a barrier.
Well, Matt Hancock, it would be news to Matt Hancock what you've just said, Mark. I can't resist asking another slightly provocative question. Mark, in my previous role at the King's Fund, one of the great things was visiting lots and lots of centres at health services across England. And my sense was even where we were doing this really, really well, that the health side of things was the hardest to integrate. And often enough, you could have a wonderful community facility with great connections on the ground floor. and then you would go up the escalator or the stairs to the first floor for the consulting rooms, and they would be in splendid isolation. Is there a way in the design of our facilities or the process to really bring the health people into the community space?
Yes, I mean, I think there is in terms of design, but I think it's more about people design. So what we're trying to do is actually not have separate spaces. So the rooms are bookable. They're bookable by any clinician or by any group. Voluntary sector will be using the same interview rooms as the mental health services. That kind of thing. I think it's also about, we're starting, the Plymouth project won't open until 2024 probably, but we're starting the work around integration now. I think it's also worth recognizing that the way in which general practice has shifted is already shifting that to a much more community focus. And we have a number of people here on the call who are social prescribers. That shift is towards a social model rather than a medical model, and that's a not insignificant shift. I think the ICS legislation, which is supposed to include a commitment to addressing health inequalities, forces the NHS to begin to think differently and to think about how we work in a much more capacity building, health generating, salutogenic kind of way. But I think it is a real challenge. I think the design can help. We're looking at the main waiting room effectively being the cafe downstairs, and there are subwaits upstairs, which people will go to in advance of their appointment. So it's really trying to shift the design so it builds that sense of relationship, and water cooler moments, the opportunity to mingle and chat and just, those are possible within design.
Super, thank you, Mark. And just looking in the chat, very few takers for my suggestion on the tickets there. Will, we met a few years ago, Will, in relation to your work with the Portuguese community and now more broadly the community in Stockwell. You don't have a single facility that you can build like Bromley by Bow, but you've been leading a wonderful program to connect existing facilities. Can you tell us a little bit about this? And also, what's your underlying thinking about how you make these facilities work together?
Great, thanks, Ben. This has been fascinating listening to everyone speaking so far. Like I think a lot of people on this call here, if you've been to Bromley by Bow, you come away hugely inspired by the kind of feeling, the gut feeling that you have. And no doubt, Laura, when you go into your surgery, there'll be a similar sort of thing. What is that essence? What is the kind of what is happening behind the scenes that makes it tick? And I was absolutely kind of captivated by that. Not what I saw, but almost how it was being done. And that for me was the really key thing to take away, because I think everyone goes there and wants to cut and paste the picture postcard of the, some of the photos that Dan showed earlier. I need that kind of building, I need that green space, I need it all in one area, I need a cafe, so it's very tempting to kind of just focus in on what activities are being run or what you need in an overall center. And so when I came away with it, I was thinking about, how can I replicate all of these things that are happening here where I don't have a building? I'm actually, and I frame that as a really positive thing. I wasn't limited by one building. I'm not limited by one space. Actually, we can do all the things that everyone's just been describing by thinking about how we could do that as a network, how we could think about it as a community or as a place. So I was, and at the same time I visited maybe about 7 or 8 years ago, amazing GP that I work with, Dr. Vic Sharma, who I've done lots of work with in Stockwell. He also went to Bromley by Bow separate to me. We didn't know that we'd both been there. He came away with the same thing, which is he works in a practice that's very limited. The space that he's got in a kind of typical council flat in Stockwell, in a council building block that's owned by Hyde Housing. There's no scope really to do what Laura's done. But the scope of limitation is in your imagination. So how is it that you can think, well, actually, how do we create that juxtaposition of health and community and housing and arts and sports, growing? All of that stuff happens in Stockwell. It just doesn't happen all in exactly the same space, but it's all happening in a kind of interconnected community. So, and it's really interesting, you talk about concierges or connectors. Yes, you can have that in a building, but there's an awful lot of amazing people who are your community connectors. You know, the local person who knows everyone on your street, the kind of equivalent of the water cooler person who's in your office that knows everyone there. But you'll find those people in lots of settings. They might be called a community development worker. They might just be called the person that runs your sports club, who's really interested, you know, the arts person that's just always running it, you know, at the community fair, at the Stockwell Festival for us. So we sort of set about saying, well, how could we replicate Bromley by Bow, but without the space? How could we take that essence, that ethos, you know, some of the how, I guess, you know, like building on the assets that you do have, not what we don't have. That shifting of power, the creating of spaces, just not physical spaces, but you know, network spaces or meeting spaces where people felt that they were being heard, that they could contribute, that we were on an equal footing, that we were sharing our assets and our resources, our imagination. So really for us, it was a kind of way of working. And we've done a lot of the things that everyone else has described. You know, we have got an amazing pharmacist who uses his meeting room in his consultation room in his pharmacy, you know, Carmen in Hill's pharmacy, and he opens it up to the voluntary sector. And he's got loads of voluntary sector groups working out of his pharmacy, talking to patients when they're there. That's in a separate venue to where we go down to Art for Space, which is our, you know, one of the amazing local arts groups, and we hold, you know, NHS meetings in that space. We get people out of the primary care network and they go down to it and say, oh, this is fantastic. Well, what's this place? Didn't really know about that. Okay, we can start to do more social prescribing and cross-referring. Didn't realise that Art for Space had got funding from the Arts Council. A bit like Laura was describing, we've got some funding to do mental health programmes, but those sorts of things are just happening all the time, but are never really under the radar of the NHS or others because we're just not aware of it. And equally, they're knocking on the door, trying to find the social prescriber, and social prescribers are getting hundreds of emails every day saying, send people to my program here. So what we created was under the brand of Thriving Stockwell was kind of simply a network. I call it more than a network. I call it a movement, because I really feel the active element is so important here. That we created a network of people who are doing stuff in the local area, who simply wanted to collaborate, who wanted to create a thriving community, who are already active doing stuff. Kind of your connectors group, right? What are we all up to? Let's start building those relationships. You know, we're 3 years in now to doing this, and maybe it'll take us 12 years, and we might end up with our own space at the end of it. But we're not limited by trying to create one space. We are looking at all the spaces we have. And even where I am right now, I'm in a GP surgery now. I phoned up and was like, look, has anyone got a meeting room? I need to do this call. I've got an event afterwards I need to run. And yeah, great. They're really happy. They're like, yeah, great. You can come in and you can use our space. And so we're starting to share, you know, these things are all possible when you start to build those relationships. So it's been really, really exciting for us. And we started off in Stockwell, but now there are various other thriving communities that have started to emerge. In North Lambeth, which is the sort of neighbouring primary care network. We're really interested, could we do something here? We're slightly different. We have a different makeup of our community. We have different buildings and spaces, you know, and so you replicate the kind of way of working, that ethos, rather than trying to cut and paste exactly what happens in Stockwell, in North Lambeth, or in Streatham, or in another part. I actually do similar sort of things. You mentioned the Portuguese community, and someone also mentioned the Tessa Jowell Health Centre on the chat. We do this, I get involved in things like the Southwark Culture, Health and Wellbeing Partnership, the Lambeth Portuguese Wellbeing Partnership. It's the same model, which is about bringing people together around a community. Those are communities of interest or community of language or culture, and saying, look, if we share what we're doing, if we share that creativity, have some fun while we're doing this, what assets do we have, and how do we work? How do we work together? So really, that's what we've been focusing on, and we're now sort of talking to and we're ready to talk to you, Ben, in the future about how South East London we could do this at integrated care system level. But we're talking with our sort of Lambeth Health and Care colleagues about a Thriving Communities programme. Love to connect it into the National Thriving Communities programme, because it feels like this could be a way in which we can replicate what's happening at Bromley by Bow without sort of just thinking about the physical assets that we have.
Super, thank you so much, Will. That's the challenge, isn't it? Replication, but what's the right model of replication? Because so many of the models that we've tried don't seem to quite work I'm hoping to come back to Dan on this point towards the end. And I was really struck. I remember you prompted me. This was a great memory of our discussions on this a few years back. Is just how we need the investment in the people to connect the different services that we bring together in shared facilities. And I remember when we were talking about this a few years ago, Will, I came away thinking, yes, we're quite happy to spend, I don't know, 10 million on a new healthcare centre in London that's supposed to bring everyone together, but we're not prepared to spend, or we don't often spend the money, small amounts of money on the people who we need to convene and curate that partnership. Super. Well, thank you. We'll come back to you. Ria, NHS Property Services, of course, oversees many facilities around the country. And I know you've also been leading some really interesting projects, such as the Michael Burke Centre in Suffolk, which also bring together health, the voluntary sector, other services in a single hub. Ria, that a lot of the time we encounter barriers, that there's a sense that there are bureaucratic rules that get in the way. And I'm wondering, what's your advice on what are the big things that we need to navigate, and what's your advice on how to get around them? And I think that not all of these barriers are quite as big as maybe people think.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. I think, just to follow on, I guess, from the intro, I think a lot of you on the call will possibly know who we are already, but NHS Property Services are part of the NHS. We own and manage, it's around about 10% of the NHS estate, which sort of sounds like a small proportion, but in itself works out to be about 3,000 buildings. So as Ben said, a big kind of opportunity to look at sort of how those are used. What we've been doing over the last couple of years is trying to identify where there might be space within those buildings that is either completely vacant or very underutilized, and see how we can bring those back to life, very much kind of focused on supporting the growth of social prescribing networks, so going to kind of the end of the chain and saying how can we bring in some of these community-led services that people would normally being referred into, so that those organizations don't have to worry about space, they don't have to worry about something not being secure or not being safe or not being fit for purpose, and they can focus more on just delivering the services, reaching more people and helping more people. Again, Ben, as you kind of alluded to, that in itself does not come without challenges. We've got about 28 of these sort of community hubs up and running at the moment, and a few kind of smaller green patches where it's just some allotment beds or some kind of meeting space that people can use. But as I said, it's been over the course of 2 years, so it is taking a while. We do regularly come up against a range of challenges. Some of those are driven by us as an organisation and the policies and processes that we have in place. Some are others that we encounter through other sort of NHS structures. And what, I guess, if I had to sort of summarise what they kind of look like, I think the first is very much around almost the assumption that there are too many barriers. I think people come into the NHS thinking it's been around forever, we've got all these processes, we've got all these policies, it's just going to be too much effort, without really taking the time to say, okay, but what are the challenges going to be? People just come automatically against to say a sort of no. And what we've seen with the spaces that we've developed so far, the ones that we're getting into place with, is that everyone wants it to happen. Everyone sees that using these sort of spaces and the kind of pitch that we have for these hubs, people always nod along and people are like, oh yeah, no, that sounds brilliant. And then when it comes to actually doing it is when it's, oh, but what about the leasing and who's going to pay the bills and what happens if this needs repairs? And it just suddenly becomes this big long list that's just too much for people to deal with, and it ends up in a no. The way that we've started to turn some of those around is just being able to really engage people and say, I know it sounds great, but actually come and look at this site that we've already done, or let us show you a video of someone that uses this area, and the difference it can make to them. And then all of a sudden, all of those questions around kind of leasing and bills and repairs and all of that kind of stuff, people start to see ways around them. Rather than using those as a reason to say no, it becomes, oh, actually, well, yeah, maybe that leasing document wouldn't work, but I heard that this person did it this way and maybe we could look into that. But you need that engagement with people initially to show them the impact it can have before they can start to problem solve. And I think that's what we're really reliant on, is that as a CSR team, as the kind of having oversight for the social prescribing program, we're not property managers, we're not facility managers, we're not experts in any of those areas, and we're really reliant on the experts that we do have being able to see the benefit so that they can start to come up with some of the solutions themselves and being able to take those forward. I think just the sort of second challenge that I wanted to touch on, and I think maybe a couple of things in the chat have sort of highlighted this, is the being able to show the impact that these spaces can have. I think from an estates and a properties perspective, timelines work completely differently to community timelines. And for us as a property firm, you know, a building that's got 5 years left on the lease is seen as short term, and it's not worth investing in because it's only got a few years left. But as a person, if I was accessing a health service, 5 years could change my life, and it could make completely turn things around. But the property world doesn't see 5 years as being a long period of time. It's seen as being short. So I think it's being able to tell those stories, being able to engage the right people, being able to showcase the impact these sites they can have. So that firstly, you can start to unlock some of those barriers, but also you can get people to understand that, you know, even 6 months is huge, and it doesn't need to cost loads of money. It doesn't need to be really expensive. It can just be some kind of small changes to a site that can give 6 months worth of service to a community, can make a real difference.
Super, Ria. Thank you so much. And I think you're absolutely right. My sense is there are some tangible barriers, but the biggest barrier is the perception that we should say no to risky things in the NHS, or things that we perceive as risky, and the lack of time that we have to pursue interesting new ideas. And I speak as somebody who now works for a CCG, and we're pretty expert at putting up bureaucratic barriers. But Ria, and you also raised a very important point, I think, which is, as well as the wonderful design of these facilities, there's a really simple thing we can do as well, isn't there? We can just throw our doors open and let people use our facilities if people need a room wherever we can. That's a really valuable thing to do for our communities. So we're getting various questions coming through. Many are under the cloak of anonymity. So I'm going to read some of these out, but I noticed that Nev Connor, Rob Clark and Lisa Holden, you dared to put your names against your messages. So I might in a minute just ask one or two of you to come online and talk directly to the panel if you're willing, only if you're willing. If I can start with you, Mark. One of the challenges that people have raised is, how do we persuade the authorities, local authorities and the health system to invest in the sort of model that we've seen in Bromley by Bow? And it strikes me that is quite a challenge, because there's enthusiasm for spending money on big flashy centres, but there's less enthusiasm for the sort of very community oriented approach that we see at Bromley by Bow. So if you can start, what's the secret to persuasion?
And I think it's worth remembering that there's a whole range of things. I mean, look what Laura described, and is very similar to what Bromley by Bow did, was take the GPs themselves taking out a loan, puts them entirely in control of how that money is. And it's really important for us to remember that that's an option. Certainly in terms of the Barking Riverside project, because it's a new town, has a significant amount of Section 106 funding. So that's statutory funding to offset the impact of the development. So that money has to be spent anyway and it's bringing together, Barking Riverside is bringing together the health facilities, leisure facilities, and the community facility, which were originally in the Section 106 in 3 separate buildings. But we, surprise, we felt that actually they were all related to health, and that they were better located in a single asset. So I think the vision, in some ways, is going back to Will's point. Actually, you don't need a building at all. The vision is the key thing, that Section 106 could have been spent on 3 separate buildings and have no community engagement whatsoever in health, and the physical activity all took place somewhere else. But actually, there was a shared commitment that actually health is about healthy communities and the resilience and agency of local people, and that our role within the public sector is to support them at times of crisis and illness. So it provides completely different context. So I think that vision is key. Plymouth is a similar model. It started actually as a local authority project at the west end of the city really is a catalyst for regeneration of what is a very disadvantaged part of Plymouth. So they were looking at finding the capital and using a rent model to capitalize a rent model in order to develop that. But the NHS got involved around putting in NHS funding, capital funding in this. The model is absolutely about health on the high streets. The report that came out last year from NHS Confed, it's seeing health, it's seeing the opportunity to really drive better employment, footfall within the city, access to the NHS future workforce, because we're working with colleges and the university and things like that. So I think there are funding routes out there to do this in a different way, or we can do it in the same way as we always have, and that has abysmally failed. So there's something about learning from the past, and certainly the Plymouth project is one of 6 projects nationally that is trying to test a new NHS funded model around integrated collaborative health and wellbeing hubs wrapped around general practice, but are essentially first and foremost community hubs. So there is funding, and there will have to be funding going forward, irrespective of what happens in the strategic spending review going forward. We know that there is going to have to be an investment in NHS estate. So the vision and the commitment to work in a very different way, and then learning. There was another comment in the chat I noticed. We are appalling within the NHS at actually learning from other people and what works elsewhere. Our community is completely different, and therefore we can't do it the same. So how do we learn from what else is going on? In a way that we've tried to do, I guess, through this webinar, which is, it's not about picking up Bromley by Bow and transporting it and transposing it into another community. It's actually saying what are the core principles that sit behind the approach that Bromley by Bow has made, and then saying, okay, what works in our community, and working with the community around what works in our community. Does that in any way answer the question, or have I answered the question I wanted to answer?
I hope it was both. But thank you, Mark. I have another quick question. And I hope that Will can pick up on this as well. There have been various questions in the chat about just how we go about engaging communities really effectively. For example, do we need to provide training and support for community members to engage in these processes? And it strikes me that this is where the NHS gets a bit stuck, because we just find this, personally, in my new role as an NHS manager, I just feel a little bit at sea. What do I do? Who do I talk to? Will they be able to engage? What's your advice to an NHS manager like me about how to manage these engagement processes effectively? And Will, I'm grateful for your advice too after Mark.
I'm stealing what Will said earlier. But the point is that within these communities, there are already people who are performing these roles. It's, they're not, even in the most disadvantaged communities, there are people who are already very actively engaged to support their peers and local residents. So it's very often about actually finding the people who know those people and bringing them together. So it is about relationship. I think it's also, we have a language problem. We use a health language that is very exclusive. It's full of jargon, it's full of all sets of assumptions. That doesn't make sense even to our local authority colleagues, never mind to local community members. So there's something about shifting away from the kind of language that we're used to using, a very clinically based medical model. I think it's also that there is something that has to be about mutuality. In reality, we are getting the benefit for the relationships that an organization or individuals already have. So what do we give them in exchange? So there's something about that. It has to be a mutual exchange. Otherwise, what we're doing is yet again taking from this community, rather than actually, most of the communities that I've been working with for many a year are over consulted and under responded to. So they're used to people asking them things and us not doing anything about it. So there's something about a much more equal relationship and a much more accountable relationship. I didn't talk about governance at all in mine, but one of the things that Dan talked about is Bromley by Bow, has an independent board of local residents that, hold Bromley by Bow to account. We're looking at the same in Barking Riverside. The community interest company will own a significant proportion of the building. In Plymouth, we are looking at what community accountability looks like. So there's something about shifting that power to be accountable to the local community. Those are a number of thoughts.
Super, thank you, Mark. And Will, any quick further reflections before I move on to Laura with a few questions on the arts and co-location and other matters. But on this question of how we engage the community really effectively in the design process.
Yeah, I mean, I think the number one starting point is that this isn't a health agenda. This is about a collective agenda. So it starts with listening, and it starts with creating a completely different environment. Because I think where it starts with health needs to, drive this and push it forward. And this is really hard because obviously we're here having a kind of health outwards conversation. So the training I actually think that's needed is not for the community. The training and development is for you, Ben, and for others within the system to understand how to work in this way, how to let go of power and control, because it's really hard. Laura just knows how to do it. She's had to work really, really hard to literally bash down walls to do it physically, as well as, and that's really, she's a GP, not skilled in necessarily change and community development, but there's an awful lot of people outside there that do have that skill set, and I think there's people on this call who I know who run those training programs, where I think it's those collective things where we learn how to let go of our own agendas, and we learn how to work together. We learn how to create those co-productive environments that we realize that it's not something that others need to be trained in. It's something that we all need to go on the journey, because it's hard, but I think that's where I would start. And the number one thing for me is about relationships building. It's creating that reciprocity. So what's in it for all of us? How do we create something where we all understand each other's needs and what we all want, and therefore create something that works for everyone, not something that says, this is what we need from health, and this is what we're going to want to train you in. And that happens. This kind of way of working happens on a, your best GP or your best consultant is when you go and meet them, and you really feel that person's listening to you, and they're working with you. They're not telling you what to do and what medication to have. And this is the same principle that we have. So that's what I would say. So hopefully that answers your question, man.
It does absolutely, Will.
Provocative.
It absolutely does, Will, and I accept the response. I am the one who needs the training. Laura, there was a question about the importance of having complementary therapists in the same building, co-located with other primary care services. But I'd welcome your thoughts on the general question of how important it is to co-locate a range of physical health, mental health, and other services and activities in the same practice. And is that the only way of doing things? You're on mute.
I think what Will has been doing is incredibly inspiring, and we sort of do that a bit because we are in quite a small practice in the middle of the city. So we use there's a complementary therapy place just opposite us with a big yoga space, and we sometimes use that. And so we do use kind of different places, and we're linked in with through all our social prescribers and stuff into other voluntary organisations as well, which is really supportive and brilliant. But there is something very powerful about co-locating and the conversations that you have while you're making tea in the kitchen or in the corridors. And I think that's something that general practice lost a lot when we lost all our district nurses and health visitors out into the separated agencies, where now they have all the district nurses work from different buildings, and you don't really know who your district nurse is anymore, and they change frequently. They change their names frequently, so they're called district nurses or cluster 7 IPCT and things, and it's hard to kind of keep in touch with that, and it makes a huge difference. So we we meet our therapists. I was just chatting to one of our osteopaths down in the kitchen earlier, and we've just started a trauma program looking at complex trauma, which we think underlies an awful lot of chronic disease, pain, and recurrent use of the health service in general. So we managed to persuade the PCN to fund a big complex trauma program, which is almost essentially actually run by our complementary therapists. So we've got somatic release therapy and acupuncture, alongside 2 GPs who specialise in trauma, and a nutritionist, and a counsellor therapist. And that wouldn't have come to being if we hadn't been standing in the kitchen talking about it, and all the different ways with our yoga teacher and stuff of how we manage trauma, and how we've sort of all felt that trauma was such a underlying part in people's unresolved healthcare needs. So lots of people who come repeatedly to us with persistent pain, persistent symptoms of any sort really, often have trauma. Some of our hardest to control diabetics are very traumatized people who suffered a lot in their childhood, have very high ACE scores. So I think having contact with people that you wouldn't normally maybe talk to is just a really important part of that co-location. And I think that can happen digitally, and it can happen when you're connecting through a platform like Will's, but there's something, I think it's probably a bit deeper when it happens in person, is my experience. And yeah, it's been amazing to work with them. It's completely changed how I practice.
Thank you so much, Laura. There was I think a provocative question in the chat. Now that we're moving to online appointments, do facilities really matter? And clearly the shift online is an interesting challenge for our thinking, but at the end of the day, we are a human animal. We need to look each other in the face in 3D some of the time. And you're suggesting that some of the connections have to happen in face, in person.
Yeah, I mean, I think what COVID has taught us is that you can do a lot online and telephone appointments, but people really, really, really want face-to-face appointments more than anything. So, I mean, we are only now delivering 7% less face-to-face appointments than we were before the pandemic, but we're delivering 700% more telephone consultations. So it's good to have them both. And I think they work really well together. And, I think it's made everybody use remote systems more, which has opened up things to so many different people and lots of different connections, which is incredible and fantastic. But I think you really need that face-to-face as well. Yeah. I mean, a lot of our arts programs, I think we'll keep a portion of them online, because actually what it did enable us to do was to reach people who are housebound and that sort of thing that weren't able to join into those kind of things before. So that's been a really powerful thing. So we'll definitely keep some online and remote art groups going and group consultations and things. But I think generally the sense is that people want to be seen in person when possible.
Yes. And this totally unfair barrage of criticism of primary care at the moment from our politicians, within all of that noise, there is a kernel of truth that people do need to be seen face to face. Ria, I'm just wondering whether NHS Property Services has been thinking about this. Will there be a substantial change in our demand for physical space? And I'm wondering, does that release an opportunity to use the space differently in future?
Yeah, I think there's definitely a change, I think, as Laura said, in how people feel, and a lot of things that traditionally you might see that people want to see people in person for. They're now very happy to do it over the phone. It's just a bit easier. You take some of your day back, but more other issues that potentially have developed out of the last year and a half. So a lot more mental health concerns where people just say, I just need to see somebody. And in some of these, the social prescribing hubs that we've created, it's actually been the volunteers that work on them, although they're there to kind of help keep the hub along. They're the people saying that this just has made the biggest impact to them, and being able to have some structure back in your day, being able to see people, every Monday afternoon you're going to the hub to help out in the coffee room or whatever it might be. That's the difference it's kind of made. I think for us on the broader NHS estate, yeah, definitely we are seeing change. We've been doing a bit of work to try and survey patients. So obviously talking to customers, but also directly to patients. So what do you sort of expect to see here? What is it that you're here for, broadly speaking? No kind of specifics. But why do you want to come to an NHS facility, and what do you want to see? And then, yeah, Ben, exactly as you say, does that free up an opportunity? If we can cut down on the number of clinical rooms because we're being told that that's not needed anymore, what can we use those for instead, rather than it just be more empty space in the NHS estate? Can we bring in other services instead of kind of your traditional clinical services?
It's exciting, isn't it? Because it does feel that there are opportunities to join people together digitally that are hard to achieve physically, even if we need the physical stuff too. So much easier to create a proper multidisciplinary team meeting with the patient there as opposed to outside the room, with the hospital doctor, the social worker, the GP, if we do this online, but it can't be the only thing. I just wanted to test now, I'm conscious of time, but I did want to see whether Nev Connor and Lisa Holden were willing to put their videos on and raise the points that they put in the chat. Nev, thank you. You're on mute.
Okay. Yes, I am. I'm going to slow down because I've never taken so many notes in my life from a meeting. Normally, I go to NHS meetings or anywhere, and I'm looking for the light bulb moment, or I feel like I'm the only one in the room with even kind of ideas. So my question was really about, I realised over the last few years just how much environments affect us all, and some of this is not by mistake. If I think about the environment where I grew up in, like in a city, if I think about where I played sports, or if I go to a military environment, or even where I work now at a hospital. Recently, I had an event. I was going onto the ward to speak to some patients, and I just had a sensory experience where I was just overwhelmed by the lights, the noise, the smells. And then it made me realise just I could have the opportunity to walk away from there. But when you go on a ward and you have to stay there, it's very different. So I would love to go to a space, and what you're talking about, where you just walk onto a space and instantly you feel better and well. And that's kind of like what I'm getting from you all here. So I'm just curious to see how much the sensory plays into or feeds into whatever you do around design. And Laura, you talked about art as well, and when you first come into a location. And I think a lot of people, especially clinical people, kind of forget that. So I know it's probably not a question, but it's just an observation. And in regards just quickly around communication and with community, I really don't think it's that difficult, because most people know how environments affect them. You just need to ask them rather than assume to design something that, they might not even need. So yeah, I'll be quiet now. Thank you.
Nev, that's fascinating and hugely expressive. On the community stuff, though, it's not the community members who know what they want that's the problem. It's me, the NHS bureaucrat, who's been inculcated in particular ways of working.
Okay, just quickly on that, how about we try feeling first before we think? I will do my best. That would help.
I will do my best, but it goes against decades of training. Can I just go and ask? Is Rob Clark there? Rob, you have an interesting background, and you raised an interesting question on MDTs.
Hi, yeah. So I'm just reflecting on what Mark said as well. So Mark said that the NHS is appalling at learning from others, but it's also appalling at learning from its past mistakes and what didn't work. And so I can recall a time, it's probably about 97, 98, where a similar model to this was proposed, and I think the term used was polyclinics, where GP surgeries would be these hubs where patients could access not just medical care, but alternative care and whatever they really required. And I thought at the time that's an excellent idea. And so for hearing to this now, I think it's brilliant, and I'd like to thank all the panel. but there's an element of flared trousers for me, and so I just, you know, want to know if anybody has any idea why this original polyclinic model that I'm aware of wasn't expanded, why it wasn't rolled out, why it wasn't embedded, and why we seem to be back at this same conversation again.
So
if I could make a suggestion that doesn't put Ben on the spot as an NHS bureaucrat, it was entirely political. I mean, it was a Darzi proposal, and he fell out of favour. I mean, that's my limited understanding of it. So I think the model, you know, the Bromley by Bow was one of the early healthy living centres, and that was a funding route in 1997, I think it was, when Labour first came to power. So that there's a recognition of the model. But there was a sense in which it fell out of favour, not least politically. Although I did see a comment there, was also because they're too expensive. And there is there is a theme in there, I know, in the comments. We have got to be able to afford these, and actually the capital, going back to your earlier question, Pen, the capital is never the issue. People will lend you money. It's actually, can you afford to run the building in the long term? So there is a real challenge there in terms of particularly these new buildings. Are they affordable?
Mark, you and Rob have created the perfect segue for me to bring Dan Hopewell back in, because this, Dan, really is the fundamental question. We have a wonderful model in Bromley by Bow. We have other lovely examples, different but similar and different and wonderful examples, such as Laura's and Will's, and the facilities Mark's working on. But we haven't cracked this question of spread. And I think, Mark, I think you're right. Politics was part of the problem with Aradazi's clinics, but I wonder whether it was also quite the right model. Dan, you've been watching this for a while, and we've got new initiatives to spread holistic models of primary care. What's your sense of what's going wrong and what needs to happen differently?
Thank you, Ben. It's been a most amazing session, and I'm looking forward actually to listening to the recording because there's so much in this. I think we need to think about a number of levels of scale, I guess, in all of this. But one of the things I wanted to say was, and I was talking to the GPs at Bromley by Bow, and I've been talking to a number of others actually, of course, general practice is under the most enormous degree of pressure at the moment. And it probably will be for several years to come, thinking of the sort of backlog that there is of care. And that's undoubtedly probably both the worst, but also the best moment for creative thinking. The worst in the sense that nobody's got the headspace for it, and in a sense everybody's just trying to run faster to keep up, and that really doesn't create that sort of space that you need. It's probably also the time that creative thinking is most needed. I think we need to create space for people to think creatively. I think we need to give people the courage to do that. One of the challenges that primary care undoubtedly faces, of course, is that GPs are independent contractors contracting into the system, and they're not actually very subject to command and control. You know, if you talk to one social prescribing link worker who services 5 GP practices, they'll tell you that it's done differently in each of the 5 practices. They are often almost like personal fiefdoms. Indeed, Laura, you talked about the challenges you faced in the practice that you previously were a partner in, for example. I think we need to back those who want to make the change. And I think the NHS has a duty, I think, to support those who really want to make the change. And we need to find the mechanisms. We need to create some support mechanisms to help people to do exactly what you've just done, what you've told us about, Laura, and support people, and what you've done, Will, in Stockwell as well, which is make change within the existing estate, as it were. And how we build, I think primary care networks offer a huge opportunity. Something we've been talking to the Health Creation Alliance, and they're on this session here today, is about how do we shift maybe from something that the NHS is currently calling primary care networks to something we might call health creation networks, which would probably look a bit like Thriving Stockwell, which is an alliance between a primary care network and its community and the third sector partners within that community, who come together and create a new network, which is a health creation network. I think that could be a significant shift, actually, and really help us. You don't need to build lots of facilities to do that, but you'd be doing something as Will has just described, I think. But I think how we get people to do things in different spaces is also important. You know, Will, you talked about the fact that you're in a health setting and you asked for some space this morning. You know, how do we get GPs likewise to get out of general practice and start to do some things in community centres? And how do we get nurses to run health you know, we're all talking about moving to group consultations. That doesn't need to happen in a clinical setting, obviously. That could equally happen in the community settings. How do we get people to experience the different spaces? Again, I'm thinking about things we can do practically now that don't require huge expenditure. Whilst we also build, you know, let's also build a set of exemplars as well, such as Barking Riverside, such as Plymouth, such as in Ebbsfleet, and so on and so forth. I think that's also important as well, how we model new centres for the future, and we need support for that. One of the challenges that we will find about that is money. We come up across the challenge of the fact that the health systems can pay for money, maybe the local authority can pay for money, the voluntary sector and the community can't pay for space. And that is a continual challenge. And then you start to make compromising decisions that actually undermine the model that you're trying to create in that. And I think we need to have some courage around this. And that courage has to come from understanding what we're trying to do, which is not treat illness, but create wellness. And that's such a fundamental shift. And that needs to be the guiding light behind all of this. And it needs to be the kind of the pole star by which we're making our decisions, actually. Those are some thoughts from me for now. But yeah, and we're lining up a second seminar for January, by the way. So we want to keep this conversation going. We want to support everybody to take this further at whatever scale people want to work at. I think this is such an important agenda.
Dan, thank you so much. We are very, very close to being out of time. But what a wonderful note to end on, Dan. I was struck listening to you over a number of years now that probably one of the reasons why the approaches to spread we've adopted don't work is because we miss what really matters in a Bromley by Bow model. We revert back to medical models in our polyclinics and our Cavill centres, and we think that we can roll it out like a McDonald's franchise, cut and paste, as Will put it, rather than focusing intently on the values and the ways in which you worked with your communities. Look, I wanted to thank everyone. Thank you, the Bromley by Bow Centre, for putting on this absolutely fantastic seminar. Thank you, Mark, Laura, Will, and Ria, for being a wonderful panel. Dan has mentioned the forthcoming seminar in January. If you can't wait for that, my hunch is that the people on our screen now are as expert as anyone you will find in the country and beyond. I know that, Dan, you offer some consultancy advice for people thinking about these issues, and I'm hoping that Mark, Ria, Will, and Laura could also be a source of inspiration for people. But thank you, everybody, and I hope I can listen in on the next webinar.
And thank you, Ben, for your wonderful hosting of this. It's been absolutely wonderful. I've really enjoyed the way you've kept this conversation going so well and ably. It's been absolutely fantastic. Thank you for your time as well.
It's a pleasure. I'm honoured to participate. Thank you, Dan.
Thank you. Thank you.
Cheers, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.